This is the continuation of our 12th SS story, told through the eyes of Hans Kindle. In this chapter we cover the brutal Battle for Caen, a fight marked by chaos, carnage and unimaginable suffering. A warning, this story is not for the faint of heart. It's raw, bloody and a stark reminder of the true horror of war. I'm genuinely honoured to be able to narrate these accounts for you. It's unreal what these soldiers endured. Honestly, just insane. I can still picture that evening. The sky dull and heavy with smoke. The sound of tank engines rumbling somewhere beyond the trees. Word came through that the enemy was making another push on Hill 112. They were coming from the direction of Baron, clearly aiming to solidify their hold on the ridge. We knew that ground far too well. It had changed hands more times than I could count, soaked in the blood of both sides. But this time, they were in for a nasty surprise. Our Tiger tanks, under the control of the Panzer Corps, had been positioned in and around the village of SK. They were part of our division's strength, solid, dependable, and manned by veterans who knew how to kill. I remember how quiet it was before the ambush. The Tigers lay hidden, waiting in silence. Then as the Shermans approached, they roared to life. We hit them from the flanks. The 88mm guns cracked through the air like thunder. One by one, the enemy tanks went up in flames. A whole squadron that tried to turn and face us was obliterated. It was over almost as quickly as it began. We held the line, at least for now. Elsewhere on the front, the 2nd Panzer Corps was putting pressure on the British 8th Corps and that narrow exposed corridor. They made some ground, particularly around the Grainville area, but any gains were short-lived. The British fought back with everything they had. From what I heard, Berlin had ordered our boys into the fight earlier than planned, in full daylight no less. It was madness. The weight of Allied firepower that rained down on them was like nothing even our Eastern Front veterans had ever seen. Artillery, aircraft, mortars, it all came crashing down. Still, with the 29th Armoured Brigade dug in on Hill 112, exposed at the end of that fragile corridor, orders came down. The Odon bridgehead had to be held, but the tanks of the 11th Armoured Division were already pulling back, moving north of the Odon to protect the corridor. Hill 112 was being abandoned again. It had been fought over so bitterly, yet we were watching it fall into our hands by default. Despite the cost, our attack hadn't been in vain. Then came the night of June 30th. We launched another attack under cover of darkness, the kind of operation that left your heart pounding in your ears before a single shot was fired. It started at 1:30 in the morning. Our role, as part of the Hitlerjugend division, was clear. Support the Frundsberg division by hitting Hill 112 from the east. My Panzer battalion moved out alongside Olberter's 3rd Battalion of the 26th Panzer Grenadiers. We were backed by Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. Their howling salvos lit up the darkness ahead of us as we climbed the slopes toward the hill. But something was off. There was no resistance, no return fire, no flashes of muzzle in the hedgerows. The British had slipped away during the night, taking their tanks with them and leaving behind only a few scattered men and wrecked equipment. It was eerie. We moved slowly through the battlefield, past the burned-out shells of vehicles and the torn remains of uniforms. The smell of oil and death clung to everything. Hill 112 was back in our hands. We searched the ruins, digging through what they'd left behind. Food, clothing, cigarettes, luxuries to men like us. I remember grabbing a tin of meat and stashing it in my coat, almost laughing at how surreal it felt. But we didn't have long to enjoy the moment. The Frundsberg division was trying to push further, launching fresh attacks on the Odon bridgehead and the village of Baron. But the British artillery was relentless. Shell after shell rained down, breaking up their formations before they could gain any real ground. The Hohenstaufen division had better luck north of the river, knocking out enemy vehicles and capturing a few men, but even they couldn't hold their gains for long. Everything felt temporary. The ground we bled for 1 hour would be gone the next. Eventually, Oberführer Bittrich gave the order to stop the attacks. Both sides pulled back and dug in. We were exhausted. The heat, the noise, the constant fear. It was grinding us down. But in spite of it all, we had managed something. Our sudden counterattacks had shattered the enemy's timetable. British stragglers, those left behind in the chaos, were still fighting in our rear areas, inflicting damage where they could. A few of our panzers, supported by small groups of panzer grenadiers, had managed to contain the British offensive just long enough. It had bought time for the rest of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to arrive on the battlefield, but the cost, it was horrific. During those 6 days of fighting, Operation Martlet and Operation Epsom, our division suffered over 1,200 casualties. Men I'd eaten with, laughed with, trained with, gone. Some were torn apart by artillery, others burned alive in their tanks, and the equipment losses were just as bad. Our vehicles were falling apart, supplies were drying up, morale was brittle. On the last day of June, General Geyer von Schweppenberg gave a grim report to Rommel. Our panzer formations were falling apart. Some had already collapsed entirely. By the early hours of July 1st, von Rundstedt sent a desperate signal to Berlin. He wanted permission to evacuate the Caen bridgehead, to save what was left of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from being surrounded. It was a sensible plan. We all knew it. But Berlin had other ideas. The reply came back, encrypted through the Lorenz teleprinter. The orders were simple. Hold the line, no matter what. If the enemy broke through, we were to stop them with sheer willpower or launch local counterattacks. No retreat, no surrender. Von Rundstedt had enough. He called Berlin and demanded to speak to Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff. I don't know exactly what was said, but rumour had it he told Keitel to come and take command himself if he didn't believe the reality of what we were facing. Within hours, von Rundstedt was sacked. That was the moment the writing was on the wall, not just for him, but for all of us. There would be no rational strategy, no room for retreat or regrouping. We were expected to hold our positions in Normandy. No matter how hopeless it became, the die was cast, and every one of us who remained knew that the real battle had only just begun. After days of brutal fighting, the order finally came down from Oberführer Bittrich. All attacks were to stop. We were to dig in and hold what ground we had left. The enemy did the same. It was a strange silence that followed, the kind that makes you uneasy, like something is still watching you from the tree line. Both sides were exhausted. No one had gained much, but no one had completely broken either. We stood our ground for now. I remember thinking how strange it was that we had managed to slow the British at all. Our division, the Hitlerjugend, had not just fought, we had delayed their entire schedule. They'd tried to smash through with speed and power, but our resistance had cost them time. Even our stragglers, the wounded and lost who'd fallen behind, were still fighting in pockets, taking shots at their supply lines, delaying their advance. It wasn't neat, it wasn't clean, but it had worked. A few of our tanks, scattered and unsupported, had done just enough. Our panzer grenadiers were stretched thin, barely holding the lines, but they did hold long enough for the rest of 2nd SS Panzer Corps to reach us. But it came at a price. A terrible price. In just 6 days, from Operation Martlet to the end of Epsom, we lost over 1,200 men, killed, wounded, missing. Friends I'd trained with, eaten beside, joked with, just gone. Some buried under rubble, some lost in blazing tanks, others simply vanished into the chaos. Vehicles, equipment, panzers. The damage was just as severe. We were bleeding out, and everyone knew it. General von Schweppenberg, the man in charge of Panzer Group West, had seen enough. On June 30th, he reported to Rommel that our armoured formations were on the verge of collapse, or had already collapsed in some areas. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said straight out that we were burning out fast. And he was right. You could feel it in the way the men walked, in the broken voices over the radio, in the groaning of overworked engines. Then came July 1st. Just after 3 a.m, Field Marshal von Rundstedt sent an urgent signal to Berlin. He requested permission to pull back from the Caen bridgehead in an organised retreat. It wasn't surrender, it was common sense. He wanted to save what was left of our fighting force, to extract the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from the growing trap that was forming around Caen. He knew the longer we stayed, the worse it would get. His message was clear. Let us pull out, let us regroup, and we might still have a chance. Berlin answered with silence at first. Then the order came through, encoded and cold. We were to hold our positions, no matter what. If the Allies tried to break through again, we were to stop them, not with strategy, but with sheer resistance, with desperate counterattacks if needed. There would be no withdrawal, no regrouping. We were expected to hold the line until the last man if necessary. When von Rundstedt got that response, he lost it. He called Berlin directly and demanded to speak with Field Marshal Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff. He told him, and we all heard the whispers after, that if they didn't believe the hell we were facing, they should come here and take command themselves. The line was crumbling, and we were being told to die holding it. A few hours later, Hitler sacked von Rundstedt. That was the moment everything changed. The last sliver of logic vanished from the high command. We weren't fighting for strategy anymore. We were just holding ground because someone far from the front had ordered it so. That decision, made behind a desk hundreds of kilometers away, sealed our fate. From that day forward, we knew what we were up against. There would be no retreat, no relief, no plan that made sense, only orders and the price we would pay to follow them. And still, we stood. The silence after the sacking of von Rundstedt was short-lived. It was the kind of calm that came just before another storm. None of us believed the Allies were finished. We knew they were regrouping, bringing more armour, more men, more firepower. We knew Hill 112, the corridor Caen, all of it was still part of their plan. We just didn't know when they'd strike again. So we waited, dug deep, repaired what we could, and watched the horizon. In the meantime, the damage to our division became even more apparent. Our panzers were down to a handful. Those that still moved sounded like they'd fall apart any moment. The tracks clanked and scraped, the engines overheating with every push. Ammunition was low, supplies were patchy. What few reinforcements we received were either too green to be trusted or exhausted from forced marches. Most of us hadn't slept more than an hour or two at a time. When we did, it was with our boots on and rifles nearby. The atmosphere inside the ranks changed too. You could feel it. Men were no longer talking about victory. They were just talking about surviving the next day. The jokes stopped. The letters home were shorter, or not written at all. Even the officers looked worn down. Oberfuhrer Bittrich kept a firm command, but I saw it in his face too. The realization that we were no longer controlling events. We were reacting, barely staying afloat. I remember standing guard one night just outside Esque. The fields were quiet, but my ears were still ringing from the artillery days before. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. I lit a cigarette with fingers that barely cooperated and stared across the darkness. Somewhere out there, British patrols were creeping forward, testing our defences, and beyond them, more tanks, always more tanks. By early July, reconnaissance told us what we feared. The British weren't letting go of Caen. They were preparing for another full-scale push. The Americans had been engaging the western flank, but it was clear the British had no intention of giving up on this corridor, and Hill 112, that cursed hill, would be back at the centre of it all. We'd only just retaken it days before. It had cost us everything, lives, machines, spirit, and now we were expected to defend it again with less than half the strength we'd had before. The positions were shallow, the soil was rocky, digging in was slow, but we did what we could. Sandbags, camouflage nets, makeshift bunkers, anything to buy us a few more seconds when the next bombardment began. Some of the newer troops asked me what it was like the last time we fought for the hill. I didn't answer. I just handed one of them a water canteen and told him to get some rest while he still could. There was no way to describe the horror of being shelled for hours while tanks roared through burning wheat fields and aircraft screamed overhead. You didn't tell someone that. You let them learn it themselves when the time came. Meanwhile, the High Command kept issuing orders. Hold this, move there, counterattack if possible. But it was always the same message beneath it all. No retreat. The line must be held. Caen must not fall. Not a single step backward. I started to see more and more of our wounded being pulled out on makeshift stretchers, often under fire. Some had lost limbs, others were blinded or deafened permanently. There was no glamour left, no speeches, just the raw truth of war, blood, fire, and loss. One morning, I stumbled across one of our medics sitting beside a badly wounded soldier. The man was barely alive, his chest torn open by shrapnel. The medic just sat there, head down, whispering something I couldn't hear. Maybe a prayer, maybe a lie about going home. I didn't ask. I simply walked on, because I knew more would come, and I had to be ready. Radio chatter increased as July went on. British movements were intensifying. Artillery maps were being redrawn daily. Rumours swirled of massive bombing raids being planned. Some said the Allies were preparing to flatten Caen completely, turn it into rubble before trying to take it again. Others said the Americans were making breakthroughs to the west, and we'd be surrounded sooner rather than later, but no matter the rumour, no matter the report, our orders remained unchanged. Stand and fight, no matter the odds, no matter the cost. Looking back, it feels like we were already ghosts then, just waiting to see how long we'd last. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own commands making, and though many of us still held to some shred of belief in the cause, we were learning the hard way that belief alone didn't stop artillery shells or fuel a panzer. Still, I stayed. We all did, because what else was there to do? The airfield at Carpiquet was strangely quiet in the hours before the assault began. The sky was grey, heavy with tension, and although we'd taken a few scattered shells, nothing serious had landed on us yet. That false calm didn't last long. Soon the enemy shelling began to shift, pounding the outskirts of the position, and then we heard it, the unmistakable growl of tank engines. Canadian Shermans and Churchills were rolling toward us. I was crouched low in my trench when I fired the green flare to call in our artillery. It only took a second, but that second nearly cost me my life. One of the enemy tanks spotted me. Without hesitation, it charged forward and performed a neutral turn, pivoting in place directly over my trench in an attempt to crush me under its treads. The weight of the machine pushed dirt down into the trench, half burying me alive. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All around me, tanks passed, some on fire, others grinding forward toward the village. I was completely surrounded. Then the enemy infantry arrived. I could hear their boots on the rubble, the shouting in English, the thump of rifles being reloaded. One of them spotted me in the dirt and yelled, "Hands up, SS bastard," before dragging me out like a trapped animal. They beat me with their rifle butts, in the ribs, in the face. Blood poured from my nose and mouth. They tied me up, cursed at me, then dragged me across open ground and tied me to a post. I sat there for hours, fully exposed, while German shells screamed overhead and crashed around me. I thought I would die tied to that post. Maybe I should have. Elsewhere, our 3rd Company and the men holding the hangars were under heavy pressure. The Canadians attacked in force, determined and well equipped. They kept pushing into the village itself, but it was slow work for them. Every step forward came with a price. Our resistance was described by them as fanatical, and I suppose it was. We weren't just fighting for ground. We were fighting because we knew what capture meant. The British funnies from the 79th Armoured Division brought in their strange machines, Churchill AV-RS, with massive petard mortars that fired huge demolition charges. We called them flying dustbins for a reason. When those rounds hit, entire sections of buildings vanished in a cloud of fire and stone. Flames licked through shattered windows as flamethrower tanks moved up to burn out the last defenders. Every house became a bunker, every wall a last stand. And yet, in the middle of this madness, something unexpected slowed their attack. The roar of Nebelwerfer rockets. One of our commanders had found a stockpile of 28cm and 32cm explosive missiles that had been dumped and forgotten. He quickly put them back into action. The sound of their launch, that howling, screeching wail, was something that unsettled even us, but it hammered the Canadians as they tried to clear the village. Despite it all, the village was finally declared secure by the enemy at around 1400 hours. Only 20 of our Panzer Grenadiers had managed to slip away from that burning wreck. We'd lost nearly everything there. But the 88mm guns we had positioned to the east of the village held firm and prevented the Canadians from pushing toward their next objective, the control tower and barracks. That wasn't the end of the story. Further south, the hangars near our sector were defended by men under Sturmbannführer Kraus. 3 companies of us holding firm against an entire Canadian battalion. The odds were staggering, but we didn't have a choice. The barrage before the assault was brutal. I was in a bunker when the shelling hit. Chunks of concrete broke loose and rained down from the ceiling. We sat huddled inside, waiting for it to end, listening to the whistle and crash of shells like we were trapped in a collapsing world. When the shelling finally stopped, I forced myself out and into the chaos. The scene outside was beyond belief. 2 of our mortar men were already dead, crumpled beside their tubes. Our artillery observer had a chunk of steel embedded in his back. He was still breathing, barely. The enemy infantry was already pushing forward in small, aggressive groups. We opened fire as they crept close, waiting until they were nearly at the hangars before unleashing everything we had. The first wave stalled, but it had already broken through our forward companies. Reinforcements came fast. Tanks from the 4th Company of our 12th SS Panzer Regiment rolled out from their hiding spots in the ruins of Caen. Some were Panthers, others Panzer IVs that had been dug into static firing positions. All morning they engaged the Canadian tanks, blasting them from ambush positions. Several enemy vehicles were destroyed in the opening minutes. As the Canadian infantry tried to advance again, even while mortar rounds exploded around them, they made it to within 150 yards of our lines. Our machine guns tore into them. What followed was close-range trench fighting, grenades, screams, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. Eventually they began to pull back, retreating roughly 800 yards to a small wooded area where they could regroup under cover. It felt like a victory. Brief, bloody, and fragile. Then the artillery came again, at 1600. The next attack hit us. The Canadians returned to the southern hangars with tanks and flamethrowers. This time, they broke into our lines. Krauss ordered what was left of the forward companies to fall back to HQ. He personally led the counterattack to support their withdrawal. The Panthers from the 4th Company and Panzers from the 9th slammed into the advancing infantry and tanks. They hit hard. The enemy fell back again, leaving men and machines behind them. Then the 2nd Panzer Company arrived, giving us additional fire support from the south, but it was clear by then that they weren't done with us yet. That evening, I watched as wave after wave of Allied fighter bombers roared overhead, 44 of them in total. Their targets were the 17 remaining panzers we had positioned around the airfield. Explosions tore across the landscape, fire and smoke rising from every direction. The whole world shook beneath our feet. But somehow, the southern hangars still stood. By nightfall, the Canadians had given up. They pulled back, abandoning their attempt to take the hangars, at least for now. The cost had been too high. We had survived, barely. But I don't think any of us felt like victors. Not with the bodies piled around us, not with the constant thunder of aircraft overhead, and not with the knowledge that tomorrow they'd be back. When the northern half of Carpiquet airfield and the village fell to the Canadians, word came down that it was a serious blow, not just to us, but to the entire defence of Caen. Losing that ground meant losing control of the western approach to the city, and more importantly, risking the bridges across the Orne River. It was unacceptable to the High Command. Orders were issued that night. We were to take it back, no matter the cost. The task landed in our hands. The 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment. Our 3rd Battalion had finally linked up with us again, bringing in what little strength it could, and the support companies were now gathered. We were ready, or as ready as men can be after days without proper sleep and nights haunted by fire and death. Our 2nd Battalion had taken up position in the barrack area overlooking the shattered village from the east. From there they could bring down suppressing fire with machine guns and mortars, while the rest of us, I and the 3 Battalion, would attack from the Cambayeux Road. It was dangerous terrain, open fields under the watchful eye of Allied aircraft. That's why the attack was planned under the cover of night. We would strike before dawn. We moved quietly, like ghosts across the fields. Grenadier Reif was beside me. He later told others that it was calm, eerily so, until we reached the railway embankment where a small house stood, the old crossing keeper's home. But the moment our boots crossed the tracks, it happened. All hell broke loose. The Canadians had been waiting, flares shot up, illuminating us in a pale green light, and then came the gunfire. Sharp cracks from rifles, long bursts from machine guns, and the growl of tank engines roaring to life. Men screamed, fell, scattered. We tried to push forward, but it was chaos. Their tanks opened fire, and we were exposed. 3rd Battalion was hit worst of all, not by the enemy, but by our own artillery. Friendly fire tore into us as we tried to cross the field. We dove for the only cover available, the embankment itself. Dirt sprayed into the air, bodies dropped around me, and for a moment I couldn't tell where the front line was anymore. The tracks were clogged with wounded and dead, and the noise was deafening. Pinned down and unable to advance, the attack collapsed. I Battalion alone suffered 76 casualties that night, and 21 men simply vanished in the dark, gone without a trace. Carpiquet village stayed in Canadian hands. We had failed. Not long after that, whispers of a major Allied offensive reached us, something bigger than anything we had seen yet. The Americans were pushing hard in the west, trying to break through the hedgerows near La Haye du Puy. To draw our attention away from that sector, the British were preparing a massive assault on Caen, Operation Charmwood they called it. Their goal was to pin us in place, bleed us dry, and rip open a corridor toward Falaise. They weren't just coming for ground, they were coming to crush our panzer divisions where they stood. At the front, only 2 divisions were left to stop them. What remained of our division, the Hitlerjugend, held the line near Carpiquet and north of Caen. Our 25th SS Panzer Grenadiers were positioned directly in the path of the 3rd Canadian Division and part of the 59th Staffordshire Division. To our right was the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, fresh but untested, relieving what was left of the 21st Panzer Division. The British 3rd Division was coming for them. We had dug in hard. From Itaville to the Carpiquet barracks, up to Franceville, our line was deep and fortified. The 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment stretched thin over nearly 5 miles. We had trenches, minefields and anti-tank ditches running for over 2 miles deep in some areas. It wasn't perfect, but it was all we had. Reinforcements were scarce, but a small blessing came with the arrival of 13 new Panthers, long-awaited tanks straight from the factories in Germany. They were sent to restore strength to Obersturmführer Ribbentrop's 3rd Panzer Company. Sleek, well-armoured and fully crewed, their arrival lifted morale, if only for a moment. Still, we knew what was coming. General Eisenhower was reportedly furious with the slow Allied progress and promised full aerial support. This time, weather wouldn't stop them. The attack on Caen would begin with a devastating bombing raid. And we were still in the city when the planes came. On the night of July 7th, the sky turned red. 457 bombers from RAF Bomber Command dropped over 2,300 tons of bombs on Caen. I will never forget the sound, a rolling thunder that shook the very earth. Explosions lit up the sky. Fire raced down the streets. The ground rippled under our feet, and when we finally crawled out of the bunkers, nothing looked familiar anymore. It turned out the Pathfinders had dropped their markers too far south, so most of the bombs fell on the centre of Caen instead of its northern edge. Shelling from the last 2 months had already ruined much of the city, but this was something else. The skyline was nothing but fire and ruin. Our division was mostly spared by luck. A few tanks were hit, 2 were flipped over completely. Our 3rd Battalion suffered only a handful of casualties, 7, maybe 8. The escort company wasn't so lucky, they took a direct hit. Some of the logistics columns moving through the city were caught as well, crushed in the streets or burned in their trucks. But otherwise the damage to our troops was surprisingly light. From my position it looked like the city had died. Buildings were just black skeletons against the glow. Fires raged without control. And yet somehow most of our soldiers had survived. Later, Standartenführer Meyer said it best. The front line was so thinly held, there wasn't enough of us there for the bombs to kill. Over 2,500 tons of explosives, and in the end, it only managed to flip a few half-tracks. But we knew this wasn't over. The bombing was just the beginning. The real battle was coming with the sunrise. The French civilians didn't have our trenches to hide in. Most had already fled the city, but many still remained, clinging to homes, to memories, to ruins. When the bombs fell on Caen that night, they were caught between the weight of the sky and the fury of the earth. I heard later that 300 to 400 were killed, families buried beneath their own floors, children blown apart in the streets. That was the price they paid for being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. We, meanwhile, lay silent in our dugouts. After the bombing ended, a tense calm returned, but no one relaxed. The smoke was still drifting through the shattered buildings, the candles on the map table still flickering. I remember Standartenführer Meyer standing there waiting. All of us were waiting for the attack, for the storm that surely had to follow such a monstrous display of force, but it didn't come. Not at first. No radio calls, no movement from the enemy, just silence. Meyer whispered to no one in particular that it was incomprehensible how the Allies had failed to capitalize on such devastation. But we knew it couldn't last. We had no illusions about our situation. The ground we were standing on was marked for death, and we were just placeholders until the inevitable came. The inevitable arrived at 4:20 in the morning, about 90 minutes before the sun even thought of rising. I was near Galmanche when the first shells came. It was unlike anything I'd felt before. Artillery from both land and sea came crashing down on our lines. The entire horizon lit up as if the world itself had split open. The cellar we were sheltering in shook so violently that plaster rained from the ceiling, covering the candlelit maps in grey dust. It felt like the ground was being torn apart underneath us. We had spent days stockpiling ammunition, and now it was being used at full throttle. Our own guns, mortars, howitzers, Nebelwerfers answered the barrage, laying down protective fire to shield our positions. Fighter bombers swooped overhead, machine guns blazing, picking off any vehicle that dared move. The bridges over the Orne were being shelled constantly, cutting off any hope of reinforcement or retreat. Then came the infantry. The British 59th Division, shoulder to shoulder with the 3rd Division, began their assault behind a wall of fire from 632 guns. The Canadians waited behind them, ready to follow once the initial breakthroughs were made. They came in waves, moving with cold precision, just like they had trained for. At La Bijoude, just east of the railway, the Luftwaffe's 16th Field Division was the first to be hit. To the west, our own I Battalion of the 25th Panzer Grenadiers had fortified themselves in the open fields. We had dug in deep, linking up with the 2nd Battalion in Galmanche and the Luftwaffe troops along the line. The ground had been quiet for days. Now it exploded in flame. In Galmanche, I had taken shelter in the cellar of a ruined farmhouse with what was left of my company. We had survived on rations and stale water, waiting. When the barrage lifted and rolled rearward, we knew the moment had arrived. I scrambled out of the rubble with the others and made for the trench lines. That's when we saw them. Tanks, dozens of them, rolling right at us. Our anti-tank guns had been wiped out by the earlier shelling. We were left with just a few Panzerfausts, and none of us were confident they would be enough. The earth shook with every engine that passed. Behind the tanks, we spotted the silhouettes of enemy infantry advancing, moving low and fast through the orchards and hedgerows. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the unmistakable howl of Nebelwerfer rockets. Lieutenant Kinzig had managed to get through to the battery and called down a strike on Cambay, a village just behind the enemy's front. The sky lit up again as the rockets tore through the air, smashing into their lines. It was supposed to be a last resort, a desperate call when we were on the edge of collapse. It came early, but it may have bought us a little time. I don't know. Everything was a blur. The tanks in front of us were now within 300 meters. Shells exploded around our trench, sending chunks of earth flying. My ears rang constantly. I shouted, but no one could hear me. Our artillery was still firing at Les Buissons, the wrong target, and we were cursing the delay. We were being left to fend for ourselves. Then to our left we saw the real horror. The 5th Company was directly in the path of the main assault. The enemy tanks didn't just fire into their trenches, they drove over them. I saw with my own eyes as the Shermans rotated in place on top of dugouts, crushing the men below. The enemy infantry followed behind, walking right past the twisted metal and torn bodies, checking the positions for survivors but not bothering to occupy them. In our sector, we were lucky. Somehow they bypassed us. Perhaps they thought we had already been hit. For a few brief moments it was quiet again. but we could still hear the fight raging just beyond the tree line. Gunfire, shouting, the constant thump of artillery. That morning, one of our bravest, Hauptsturmführer Thierry, the commander of 6th Company, personally destroyed 3 Sherman tanks with Panzerfausts. He ran from position to position like a man possessed. On his way to hit a 4th tank, he was killed. I didn't see it happen, but those who did said he died like a warrior. Elsewhere, Karl-Heinz Decker, a mortarman from 8th Company, was manning a position near Galmanche. He'd been there for weeks, firing round after round at any movement beyond the hedgerows. He told us later that he'd been lying in a small hole in the hedge, listening to the distant rattle of engines growing louder. He knew what was coming. He braced himself. He kept firing. That day, July 8th, 1944, was the beginning of the end for Caen. We didn't retreat. We held, but we were bleeding from every direction. By the time the Canadians began probing our positions at Carpiquet, we were already stretched thin. The Luftwaffe field division next to us had almost collapsed under the pressure, and our I battalion, 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, was holding the right flank alone, pouring fire across open ground to disrupt the advance of the British 59th Infantry Division. They were moving steadily, taking advantage of the gaps left behind by the Luftwaffe. Meyer decided to send in support, a handful of panzers and what was left of the divisional escort company. Even with our limited strength, we had to plug the holes. We weren't told much about the reoccupation of La Bijoude, but the British records later said we'd slipped men back in and re-established a presence. I wasn't surprised. Our tactics were often improvised but deadly, flanking fire from hidden positions along the railway line, sudden infiltration through hedgerows or abandoned homes. We had to fight dirty to survive. At 7 a.m., a wave of American bombers arrived, targeting supposed German assembly points for counterattacks. They were only to release their payloads if they had visual confirmation, and most didn't, but those that did still scattered their bombs wide. I watched from a crater near St. George's Church, where Meyer had set up a forward HQ in Caen Castle. You could feel the strain in the air, not just from the shaking ground, but from the uncertainty. We were waiting for the real attack to begin. That morning, General Eberbach arrived through a break in the artillery fire. He made it to our headquarters and spoke directly with Meyer. He praised our stubborn defense, but he hadn't yet heard the full story. The Luftwaffe division next to us was crumbling. When Meyer explained the situation, Eberbach's face changed. He understood immediately that things were falling apart faster than Berlin realized. He ordered what was left of the 21st Panzer Division, stationed south of the Orne, to move forward. But they couldn't get through. Naval shells were falling on the bridges and rubble from the bombing made the streets of Caen impassable. Only one reinforced battalion made it across the Orne that day. That wasn't going to be enough. While Eberbach was still with us, the news came that the British had broken through between our 2nd and 3rd battalions, specifically between Galmanche and Buron. They'd taken St. Contest and were now in position to fire on the approach to the Abbey at Ardennes. Our line was starting to fold. From the ruins of Galmanche, those who survived the initial barrage were barely holding on. Lacking proper anti-tank guns, they couldn't stop the British Shermans from rolling straight past them. But in Buren, Untersturmführer Kindle had 5 Panzer IVs hidden in ambush. As the British tanks advanced between Buren and Galmanche, heading towards St. Contest, Kindler's tanks struck. He later described it with cold precision, how they hit the Shermans in the flank from 800 to 1,000 metres out. The side armour was weaker than the front, and it made all the difference. His gunner, Willy Schnittfinker, worked fast and calm under pressure. Kindler used the intercom and even pressure from his boot to signal targets. That kind of coordination kept us alive. They knocked out 5 tanks and fired over 10,000 rounds of machine gun ammo into the infantry advancing behind. We saw them fall, scatter, take cover wherever they could. After each salvo, the panzers moved to new positions, ducking behind hedgerows to avoid return fire. Not one of those tanks was lost. Despite the carnage, the British infantry still reached St. Contest, but they were exhausted, bloodied, and pinned down by our fire from the ruins. They couldn't dig in properly until the evening. They had made a dent, yes, but they hadn't broken us. Just like during Epsom, scattered pockets of our men held out in trenches, cellars and hedgerows, bleeding the enemy of time and men. Then came the Canadians. It had always puzzled Meyer why they didn't strike us directly around Carpiquet, where the 26th SS Panzer Grenadiers and a few Panthers were exposed. But instead, in the second phase of Charnwood, they shifted north again, toward Buren and Grouchy, where our 3rd Battalion and support companies were dug in. At 7:30 a.m., the 3rd Canadian Division launched their assault. Their 9th Brigade led the charge, and it began with another monstrous bombardment. One Canadian officer wrote that the noise was beyond belief, the dust so thick it blotted out the sun. We were in the trenches, covered in grime and grit, waiting for them. Many of us had been buried in slit trenches or weapon pits dug into the grain fields. Some of us were wounded, dazed, but we still held our weapons tight. When their men stumbled into our positions, we opened fire. The shelling hadn't killed us all, and those left fought with desperation. The moment they realized they'd stepped into a death trap, they called for tank support. Their radios screamed for help as machine gun fire tore through their ranks. Our artillery joined in, hammering them from Les Buissons to the west. The Canadians were brave, no doubt, but they were also walking into a maze of mines and fortified nests. Some of our old 75mm pack guns had survived the bombardment and hit several Shermans, temporarily holding up the armour. The separation between the Canadian tanks and infantry widened as the infantry was pinned down. But eventually flail tanks came in, clearing the mines, and the Shermans pressed forward. That's when the 9th Company, holding the outer defence near Buren, was overwhelmed. The enemy tanks began roaming the field, gunning down anything that moved, rolling over trenches and turning their turrets against the village. One Canadian officer described it as the tanks, browsing, shooting up anything that looked like life. And yet, our outer ring held on. Machine gun nests in the ruins poured out fire, inflicting heavy losses and stalling their progress. The 3rd Battalion was now completely encircled in Buren. Then, word came. Von Ribbentrop's 3rd Company had been reconstituted, their Panthers back in action. Orders came from the regimental command: launch a counterattack, drive the Canadians out of Buren. I was with them. We mounted our SPWs, Hanomag half-tracks, and rolled out alongside the tanks, but the radios failed. Von Ribbentrop couldn't communicate with the commander of the SPWs, nor could the SPW leader contact HQ. Coordination was poor from the start. From my position inside one of the vehicles, I remember von Ribbentrop standing tall in his turret, shouting instructions. He stressed over and over, advance together, don't break off. The plan was basic. 1 panzer platoon would swing left of Buren, 2 on the right. We moved in quick bounds, 1 platoon covering while the others advanced. It was textbook, what we had drilled again and again, but nothing in training prepares you for the real thing. The road to Buren was wide open, and we were advancing across exposed terrain. It felt like suicide. As we passed an opening in a crumbling wall, I saw a flash out of the corner of my eye, and then 2 Panthers in front of us went up in flames just like that. A single moment, and they were gone. I screamed to the gunner, and we opened up with the machine guns, raking the opening where I'd seen movement. A split second later, an armour-piercing shell slammed into our gun mantlet, the thickest part of the Panther, and still it penetrated. It was like being hit with a battering ram. The gunner screamed, blood poured from a gash across his face. I felt something hot tear into my left arm, a splinter, small but deep. We didn't wait. The turret crew bailed out immediately, rolling off the side of the tank under heavy fire. We ducked behind the Panther as enemy rounds cracked all around us. The engine was still running. The driver and radio operator inside hadn't even realized what had happened. I climbed back onto the deck, grabbed the throat mic hanging from the turret, and shouted into it, "Reverse! Reverse!" The tank lurched backward. As we pulled out, a round clipped the antenna mount I was standing on and took my heel clean off. I fell into the mud screaming, but didn't stop. We limped back some 500 meters to our grenadiers, where I found the gunner and loader had already reached on foot. Von Ribbentrop and the rest of the company were still engaged. They had reached the edge of the village and begun dueling with enemy tanks. but the terrain was confusing. Hedgerows, drainage ditches, smoke everywhere. Suddenly, more enemy fire came from the village. A Canadian anti-tank gun, likely hidden behind rubble, fired at close range, knocking out 2 or 3 more vehicles in seconds. With no coordination and no visibility, there was no choice. We had to fall back. Some of our platoons managed to support the grenadiers still holding out in Buren, especially those stuck around the abbey ruins, but communication had collapsed. Without radios working, the attack had no unity. We lost 7 Panthers in that counterattack, 7 we couldn't afford. Still, the enemy paid heavily too. Buren had become a slaughterhouse. Our young grenadiers held every room, every crater, every wall. Many of them died there. Grouchy fell first. Our pioneer company there was wiped out. The Canadians said they secured it at 9:45, but by then, the entire company had been annihilated. Buren held longer. Canadian war diaries later described the fighting there as bitter and unrelenting. Even by the next morning, we still had pockets of resistance fighting in the rubble. Their infantry couldn't push any farther. Every time they tried, our mortars and artillery opened up again. The 88mm guns and flak cannons were working overtime. Some were even engaging ground targets, not just aircraft. One report said we fired over 2,000 high-explosive shells and nearly 3,000 armour-piercing rounds that day alone. In the afternoon, we spotted fresh Canadian units assembling in the orchard south of Buren. They were preparing for another attack, this time toward Arthy. We hit them before they could move. Every mortar, every Nebelwerfer that still had ammunition was brought into the barrage. We bought ourselves some time, not much, but enough. Meyer had grown frustrated watching it all unfold. He believed the Allied armour, though superior in numbers, was being used too cautiously. He expected them to charge forward, seize the bridges, break our back. But instead, they crept forward behind infantry, making themselves easier targets. He said they were fighting like it was still the First World War, and in some ways, he wasn't wrong. At 2:30 p.m, the Canadians attacked again, this time with another creeping barrage leading the way. The Nebelwerfer regiment fired again, along with every remaining mortar. Their advance flowed around us like a tide, reaching all the way to the Abbey d'Ardennes, where our regimental headquarters was located. We were facing collapse. I was in the fields north of the Caen-Bayeux road, now manning one of the few remaining Panthers from I Battalion, 12th SS Panzer Regiment. The regimental war diary was grim. At 1 p.m, our 1st Company and the Recce platoon, along with a couple tanks from 3rd Company, had been positioned to defend the abbey. By the time the shelling stopped, 2 of our tanks were smoking wrecks. 3 more had been crippled. One of our reconnaissance tanks was hit in the fuel tank and began leaking fire. Another had its tracks blown off. Our command tank took a hit on the optics, no more aiming systems, and the machine gun turret was destroyed. Still, we fought. We knocked out 4 Shermans in that sector alone. The Recce platoon added 5 more, along with an anti-tank gun and a couple companies of infantry. Some of it was close combat, brutal and fast. In one orchard, I saw a Canadian officer gunned down as he tried to rally his platoon. Others simply vanished into the hedgerows under our fire. By the late afternoon, the enemy tanks had reached within 100 yards of the abbey's outer buildings. But that was as far as they got. We stopped them there, pushed them back, and counter-attacked with our grenadiers. The aid station inside the abbey was overflowing with casualties. Blood-soaked stretchers, men crying out for help. The air reeked of smoke and antiseptic. Meyer ordered von Ribbentrop to press forward, to relieve what was left of the 3rd Battalion in Buron. 2 platoons of the 3rd Panzer Company moved out, determined to finish the job. But as they advanced, they ran into a wall of 17-pounder guns. The Canadian anti-tank regiment had set up a kill zone. We lost more Panthers. 3rd Battalion remained isolated and surrounded. Elsewhere, in the hamlet of Cussy, our anti-aircraft battery, part of the 12th SSAA Battalion, was forced to fight as infantry. Only 3 guns remained. Their commander stood with them, serving shells himself. They held until evening. Then they were overrun. All of them were either killed or captured. The rest of us, what remained, were still scattered in the ruins of villages. Our numbers were thinning. We had done everything we could. and yet the Canadians kept coming. By nightfall, the 3rd Canadian Division had pushed through our forward defences, but it cost them dearly. They suffered heavy losses, tanks, men, whole companies, but they had found a gap in our lines. Unlike the 59th Division, who had been bogged down in the north, the Canadians were able to punch into our southern flank. They made their play for Caen. Armoured cars and Bren gun carriers from their Recce regiment pushed straight down the N13 road, hoping to secure the Orne bridges. They didn't get far. In the suburb of Saint-Germain, we stopped them cold. One unit of our 25th Panzer Grenadiers still stood intact, Sturmbannführer Waldmüller's Thar battalion. Positioned in the fields between La Bijoude and Galmanche, they held their ground. Their trenches were sited perfectly, overlapping fields of fire with the 7th Company in Galmanche. The enemy hadn't focused on them, and so they endured. The rest of us, we bled, we burned, and we prayed for night to fall. By early evening it was clear the order to hold Caen was no longer just difficult, it was suicidal. The British had broken through the Luftwaffe's lines and were already spilling into the eastern ruins of the city. Rubble slowed them more than resistance did. Ammunition stocks were nearly empty, artillery barrels overheated, and we had nothing left to plug the widening gaps. Our flanks were crumbling, and if we stayed much longer, the 3rd Canadian and 59th British Divisions would encircle the whole of Hitlerjugend. That's when Sturmbannführer Hubert Meyer made the call, a risky one. He rang SS Brigadeführer Kramer at ISS Panzer Corps headquarters and explained the truth. Caen was lost, and if we didn't pull back now, we'd lose the entire division. There was a long silence. Then Kramer gave us the lifeline we needed. He said quietly, "Being thrown back while fighting a superior enemy could never be considered withdrawal contrary to orders. It was as close to permission as we'd ever get. Rommel himself would later approve the limited move of artillery assets south of the Orne. And just like that, our fighting withdrawal became an operational redeployment. Orders were drawn up immediately, maybe the best piece of staff work Meyer ever did. The withdrawal plan was methodical, precise, and quietly desperate. Regiment 25 would begin pulling its battalions out after dark, slipping through the burning city to reach the river. Before that, all remaining heavy weapons would be repositioned to cover the retreat. The Divisional Escort Company and the shattered remnants of the 3rd Battalion, 26 Panzer Grenadiers, would act as rear guard, holding back the enemy as long as they could. Panzer Regiment 12 would break through to any isolated units and try to extract them. Regiment 1 would maintain contact with the 10th SS Frundsberg Division on our left. Meanwhile, our artillery, whatever was still operational, would fire one last barrage before falling back across the Orne. Every branch had its role. The Flak Battalion would cover the bridges from the air. The Recon Battalion would monitor our right flank and ensure no enemy slipped through. The Pioneers would rig the bridge for demolition, though the order to blow it would only come from divisional command. Signal units were tasked with keeping communication lines alive, barely held together with wire and hope. That night, as darkness finally fell, the battlefield went quiet. Eerily quiet. The artillery slowed, the shelling faded, and under the cover of black skies and burning buildings, we began to move. We didn't march, we crept. Exhausted Panzer Grenadiers filtered out of villages and hedgerows like ghosts. We moved in small groups, some carrying the wounded, others pushing bicycles or dragging ammunition crates. Caen was behind us, glowing orange from fire and ruin. I was part of a rearguard section stationed near one of the final fallback points, a crossroads marked by the wreck of a civilian bus and the skeletal remains of a flak truck. We waited for the last units to pass through. The radio operator sat with the headset in one hand and a cigarette in the other, listening for updates that never came. At 0400, divisional headquarters moved to Garcelles. By then, most of us had crossed the river. The Canadians later called it a masterpiece of extrication. I guess from a distance it looked organised, clean, tactical, but down in the dirt it felt like collapse barely avoided. Our boots squelched in blood-soaked mud. Many of us hadn't eaten in 2 days. Some fell asleep standing, leaning on rifles or on each other. And still, we moved. Meyer's description of that night stayed with me forever. He said we had arrived in Normandy with fresh faces, blooming with youth, But by now our eyes had seen too much. Mud-covered steel helmets hid hollow cheeks. Some men looked like they'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. We were ghosts walking through the ruins of a dream. Sturmbannführer Waldmüller, always precise, went bunker to bunker, waking each man individually. There were no bugles, no shouting orders, just quiet voices and the soft thud of boots. Each grenadier had to be pulled from sleep, handed ammunition, and pointed south. The belts hung heavy around our necks, dragging our heads forward like the weight of our own failure. We hitched ourselves to 2 infantry guns and began the final movement through the lower streets of Caen. Fires lit the skyline, casting red glows on crumbling rooftops. Somewhere nearby, 2 of our remaining panzers still held the north approaches, firing short bursts to keep the Canadians cautious as we slipped away. On the southern bank of the Orne, new positions were already being prepared. Regiment 25 was ordered to dig in from the eastern edge of Vaucelles to the bend in the river. Regiment 1 took up ground from there, stretching west past Louvigny toward Éteville. This would be our new line, a shattered division guarding a ruined riverbank. There was no rest, not even for a moment. Once we reached our new line, we were told to dig, to hold, to fight. Sleep would have to wait. As I dug my position behind a pile of broken stone and overturned carts, I thought about how far we'd come, from training fields and barracks full of pride and purpose to this, defending a river from a sleeping bag of rubble surrounded by death and smoke. But none of us asked questions. Not anymore. Not about the war, the cause, or the future. We just prepared to fight again. Later, I overheard a Canadian officer quoted in a report. He said the German soldier was still as tough as ever, that even with chaos in the rear, shortages everywhere, and entire units wiped out, the Germans gave up nothing without a fight. He said that as long as there were Germans with bullets and petrol, the battle would go on. He was right.